What do you do when someone looks you dead in the eye, laughs at you, and tells you you'll never amount to anything? Most people swallow the insult and walk away, maybe replaying that moment in their head for weeks, wishing they'd said something clever. But me? The second those words hit my ears, I felt this fire in my chest. My hands tightened into fists under the table, and my jaw ached from holding back. He thought I was too weak, too small, too irrelevant to ever push back. What he didn't realize was that every smirk, every dismissive word, every single time he acted like I was beneath him, he was digging his own grave. He thought it was just another cheap shot, another chance to humiliate me. But I had already made up my mind. I was going to make sure he regretted underestimating me in the most satisfying way possible. And trust me, he never saw it coming. If you've ever dreamed of serving justice to someone who treated you like garbage, you're in the right place. We've all been there. Someone pushes you down, makes you feel small, and walks away thinking they've won. But deep down, you imagine that perfect comeback, that flawless moment where the tables finally turn. That's exactly what this story is about. So before we dive in, hit that like button if you've ever wanted to prove someone wrong. Subscribe if you love hearing stories where the underdog doesn't just survive, but wins. And I want to hear from you too. Drop a comment below and tell me, what's the pettiest or most satisfying revenge you've ever witnessed? Because trust me, by the time you hear how this all played out, you'll know that karma doesn't always wait around. Sometimes it needs a little push. I've never been the kind of guy who stood out in a crowd. I wasn't the loudest voice in the room. I didn't drive the flashiest car, and I definitely wasn't the one cracking jokes that had everyone doubled over. I was just me. The guy who showed up on time, did his work, and tried to avoid unnecessary drama. Simple, quiet, ordinary. And honestly, I was fine with that. But apparently, being ordinary made me an easy target for someone like him. Let's call him Mark. Mark was the type of guy who walked into a room and made sure everyone knew he was there. Loud voice, expensive cologne, suit pressed to perfection. He loved being the center of attention. And more than that, he loved finding someone to push down just so he could stand taller. Unfortunately, I was his favorite punching bag. It started small, little digs during meetings at work. If I presented an idea, he'd roll his eyes and mutter something under his breath like, "Yeah, because that'll work." People would laugh nervously. Not because it was funny, but because when Mark decided to pick on someone, no one wanted to be next. He had this way of turning every situation into a stage, and he always wanted the spotlight on himself. I told myself to ignore it. I kept my head down, convinced that if I didn't react, he'd get bored and move on. But Mark wasn't the type to get bored. He was the type to push until he got a reaction, like a schoolyard bully who never grew out of it. One afternoon, things went from irritating to downright humiliating. We were in a meeting with the entire department, our boss, our coworkers, even a couple of senior managers from another branch. I was presenting a project I'd been working on for weeks. My slides were ready, my notes were clear, and for once, I actually felt confident. Halfway through explaining my plan, Mark leaned back in his chair, smirked, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Why are we even wasting time on this? He can't even get his own desk organized, and now we're supposed to trust his project management skills." The room went silent for a split second before laughter broke out. Not everyone laughed, but enough people did. My boss gave this awkward half-smile, trying to brush it off, and I felt my face burn hot. My throat tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't even breathe. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to keep flipping through the slides, pretending his words didn't sting. Inside, though, I was crumbling. My stomach twisted into knots, and the voice in my head screamed, "Don't let him see you break! Just finish. Just get through this." And I did. I powered through the rest of that meeting, but every second felt like I was dragging a 100-pound weight behind me. When it finally ended, everyone shuffled out. Some avoiding my eyes, others patting Mark on the back like he'd just told the joke of the year. That moment stuck with me. I replayed it over and over on the drive home, staring at the red glow of brake lights in traffic. My jaw clenched so hard it ached, and my grip on the steering wheel left imprints in my palms. I told myself it was just another one of his stupid jabs, that I should brush it off like always. But deep down, something had shifted. I couldn't shake the humiliation. The way everyone had laughed, the way Mark looked so smug sitting there, proud of himself. That was the day a seed was planted. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but I knew I couldn't let this slide forever, because Mark had made one huge mistake. He thought I was too weak to fight back. And that was going to cost him. After that humiliating meeting, I thought maybe things would calm down. Maybe Mark had gotten his laugh, had his moment, and would move on to someone else. But I should have known better. If anything, it was like pouring gasoline on a fire. He realized he could publicly humiliate me and get away with it, and that made me his new favorite sport. It didn't take long before every interaction became a chance for him to flex his ego. If I asked a question during a meeting, he'd cut in with, "Wow, you still don't get it?" If I sent out an email, he'd reply, all with corrections that weren't even necessary just to make me look incompetent. Even in casual conversations, he'd slip in little comments like, "Some people just aren't cut out for leadership, huh?" And then look right at me. At first, I tried to laugh it off. I'd force a smile, tell myself, don't give him the satisfaction. But inside, it was eating me alive. I'd sit at my desk, staring at my computer screen, but my thoughts would just circle around his smirk, his voice, his laugh. My stomach would churn every time I heard his footsteps coming down the hallway. I started dreading work, not the workload, but the idea of having to sit in the same room as him day after day. The worst part? No one stepped in. My coworkers saw what he was doing, but they either laughed along or stayed silent. And silence feels just as loud as laughter when you're the one being targeted. That's when the helplessness started to creep in. I kept thinking, is this who I am now? The guy everyone thinks is too weak to stand up for himself? And then came the moment that pushed me over the edge. It was a Friday afternoon. The kind of day where everyone's just counting the minutes until they can clock out and enjoy the weekend. I had wrapped up a report that our boss needed, and I left it on his desk before heading to grab a quick coffee from the break room. When I came back, I walked in just in time to hear Mark holding court with a couple of coworkers. He was holding my report in his hand, waving it around like a prop in some comedy routine. "Look at this," he said, flipping through the pages. It's like he just Googled how to write a report and copied the first template he found. "I swear if this guy ever had to run the show, we'd all be out of jobs in a week." They laughed. Not everyone, but enough. And then he saw me standing there. Did he stop? No, he doubled down. He looked me right in the eye, smirked, and said, "Oh, don't worry, man, I'm just joking. You know we love having you around. Keeps expectations low," that line. Keeps expectations low. Something in me snapped. I didn't show it on my face. I just walked over, grabbed the report from his hand, and went back to my desk. But inside, it was like a switch had been flipped. All the anger I'd swallowed, all the humiliation I'd tried to bury, it boiled up and hardened into something else. Resolve. On the outside, I stayed quiet. But in my head, I wasn't replaying his insults anymore. I was planning, plotting, thinking about every possible way I could make him eat his words, because Mark had finally crossed the line. And this time, I wasn't just going to let it go. This time, I was going to get even. Once that final line was crossed, I knew there was no turning back. The humiliation, the laughter, the way he looked at me like I was beneath him, it all crystallized into a single thought. He needs to be taken down a peg. But not with yelling. Not with fists. No, I wanted something cleaner, smarter, something that would hit him right where it hurt most, his ego. The idea came to me slowly, like puzzle pieces clicking into place. See, Mark's whole identity was built on being the smartest guy in the room. He thrived on recognition, on applause, on being the one everyone looked up to. So what better revenge than to use his arrogance against him? It started with the next big project. Our department had been tasked with pitching a new strategy to upper management, something that could shape the direction of the company for the next year. Mark, of course, immediately volunteered to lead the presentation. Nobody challenged him. Why would they? He always made sure to remind everyone he was born for this kind of spotlight. But here's the thing. Leading the presentation also meant taking responsibility if things went wrong. And Mark? He was so confident, so dismissive of anyone else's ideas that he never bothered to double-check his facts or question his assumptions. That arrogance was my opportunity. For weeks, I worked quietly behind the scenes. While Mark strutted around, bragging about how his presentation was going to blow the executives away, I was digging through numbers, cross-checking data, and running scenarios. I noticed small errors in his drafts. Misquoted figures, outdated stats, charts that looked impressive but were misleading. And instead of correcting him, I let him run with them. I even fed him a few helpful suggestions that looked solid on the surface, but would crumble under even mild scrutiny. He didn't doubt me for a second. Why would he? In his mind, I was the guy who kept expectations low, the guy too harmless to pose a threat. Day by day, I watched the trap set itself. He polished his slides, rehearsed his speech, strutted around the office like a peacock, completely oblivious to the fact that the foundation beneath him was cracking. And I played the quiet supporter, nodding along, offering just enough encouragement to keep his ego inflated. Then came presentation day. The conference room was packed, executives in suits, department heads, even the regional director. Mark walked in like he owned the place, grinning, shaking hands, radiating confidence. He launched into his presentation with all the swagger of a man who believed he was untouchable. For the first 10 minutes, it worked. People nodded along, impressed by the flashy charts and confident delivery. But then the questions started. One executive leaned forward, frowning slightly. "Where did you get this data set?" Mark froze for a split second, then brushed it off with a laugh. "Oh, it's all verified. Solid sources." But it wasn't. And the more they pressed, the more the cracks showed. Another manager pointed out an inconsistency. Then another questioned his projections. His polished confidence started to fray, sweat beading at his temples as he fumbled through explanations. I sat there, quiet, expression neutral, while inside I was practically vibrating with adrenaline. Every misstep, every stammer, every panicked glance he threw around the room, it was like watching dominoes fall, one after another. By the time he finished, the room was silent. Not impressed silence, dead silence. Our boss finally cleared his throat and said, "We'll need to revisit this." Clearly, more work is required. Translation: Mark had just humiliated himself in front of the very people he'd been desperate to impress. And the best part? I didn't have to lift a finger in that room. His arrogance had done all the heavy lifting. I walked out that day with my head high for the first time in months. Because for once it wasn't me sitting in the hot seat. It was him. And he'd handed me the sweetest victory without even realizing it. The presentation fiasco should have been enough. Watching Mark stumble, stutter, and sweat through questions he couldn't answer was already a delicious moment. But the real payoff came afterward. The slow, painful unraveling of his carefully crafted image. When the meeting ended, executives filed out of the conference room with polite but tight expressions. No one clapped him on the back. No one congratulated him. Instead, there were murmurs, whispered conversations, and quick glances in his direction. For a man who thrived on admiration, that silence was deafening. I'll never forget the look on his face when our boss pulled him aside in front of everyone. "Mark, I'll need you to stay behind," he said, voice clipped. Mark tried to smile, to play it off like it was just a normal debrief, but the panic in his eyes told the truth. He looked around the room, searching for support, but nobody stepped in. Not this time. I walked past him slowly, my report tucked neatly under my arm, and for the first time, he avoided my eyes. That smirk, the one that used to make my stomach twist, was gone. His jaw was tight, his skin pale, his confidence shattered. Later that day, word started spreading. Executives had been furious about the inaccuracies in his presentation. The numbers didn't just look sloppy, they made the entire department look unprepared. And in a company where perception meant everything, that was deadly. The whispers grew louder. Some coworkers who used to laugh at his jokes now kept their distance. The same people who once encouraged his bullying suddenly wanted no part of him. It was like watching a king get stripped of his crown, one jewel at a time. The cherry on top came Monday morning. I walked into the office, coffee in hand, and there he was, Mark, sitting at his desk, shoulders hunched, staring blankly at his screen. No booming voice, No cocky laugh. Just silence. And then came the email from our boss. Mark was being removed from leadership of the project. Effective immediately. Guess who was listed as the new project lead? Me. I almost laughed when I saw it. Not because I was suddenly in charge. That part honestly scared me a little, but because of the irony. For months, Mark had gone out of his way to make me look small, incapable, incompetent. And now he was the one stripped of authority, while I was being trusted with responsibility he thought I could never handle. The look on his face when he realized was priceless. He tried to cover it to force a polite smile when our boss made the announcement in front of the team, but his eyes gave him away. His hands twitched, his jaw tightened, and for once he had no witty comeback, no sarcastic jab. Just silence. That was the moment. The moment I felt the weight I'd been carrying for months lift off my chest. The knot in my stomach loosened. The anger in my veins cooled. It wasn't about gloating. It wasn't even about revenge anymore. It was about finally being free of his shadow, finally standing on equal ground or maybe even higher. He avoided me for weeks after that. No more comments, no more jokes, no more public humiliations. Every time our paths crossed, he kept his eyes down, as if acknowledging me would reopen the wound. And I'll admit, every time I saw him like that, a quiet satisfaction bloomed in my chest. Because here's the truth. Revenge doesn't always come in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes, the sweetest revenge is watching someone choke on their own arrogance, crumble under the weight of their own ego. Mark built his empire on belittling others. All I had to do was step back and let it collapse, and collapse it did. I walked away from the whole ordeal not just with vindication, but with something far better. Proof. Proof that I wasn't weak, that I wasn't incompetent, that I was capable of standing tall even when someone tried to break me down. And for Mark, he was left with nothing but the bitter taste of his own failure. Justice served. When I look back on everything that happened, I sometimes ask myself, was it really revenge? Or was it just karma doing its job with a little nudge from me? Because on paper, what I did wasn't dramatic. I didn't expose him with some grand speech. I didn't call him out in front of the whole company. I didn't even throw a single insult back at him. All I did was step aside and let him be exactly who he was, arrogant, careless, dismissive, and eventually, it caught up with him. But here's the thing. When you've been on the receiving end of constant disrespect, when you've been laughed at, belittled, and made to feel like you don't matter, even a small victory can feel massive. It's like a crack of light in a room that's been pitch black for way too long. I'll admit, it wasn't the biggest revenge in the world. Nobody got fired, no lifelong grudges were born, no lives were ruined. But man, it felt good. It felt really good to finally see the tables turn, even just a little, and know that all those times he tried to make me feel like nothing, he was really setting himself up for a fall. What made it sweeter was how poetic it was. He underestimated me so badly that he never thought twice about taking my suggestions. He was so sure I was harmless that he didn't even realize he was digging his own hole one slide at a time. And watching him fall into that hole he built with his own arrogance, that was satisfaction money couldn't buy. Now, I'm not saying revenge is always the answer. Life isn't a movie, and sometimes walking away really is the smarter choice. But I also think there's something deeply human about wanting fairness. We all crave balance, the idea that if someone treats you like dirt, they don't get to walk away smiling forever. Sometimes life hands them consequences naturally, and sometimes you help life along just a little. The funny thing is, I didn't just walk away with a story. I walked away with confidence I didn't know I had. For so long, I believed his voice over my own. I believed I wasn't good enough, that maybe he was right. But after everything played out, I realized he never actually knew better. He just acted louder. And that's a dangerous kind of person to give power to. In the end, what happened to Mark was a reminder that arrogance eventually backfires. That disrespect has a way of boomeranging back at the person who throws it around. And that the people who build themselves up by tearing others down, they always reveal their cracks sooner or later. So, yeah, was it petty? Maybe. Was it satisfying? Absolutely. And honestly, sometimes those small petty wins are the sweetest ones. Not because they destroy someone else's life, but because they restore a little piece of your own dignity. And if you've ever been in my shoes, sitting there, red-faced and humiliated while someone with a smirk tears you down, you know exactly how good it feels when the universe finally balances the scales. Because at the end of the day, revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about reclaiming your own worth. Sometimes it's about showing yourself that you can stand tall, even if you do it quietly. And for me, that quiet victory was more than enough.